everybody. Before we begin, let me apologize for the situation we currently have. You know, the ongoing public health situation prevents us from meeting face-to-face on campus, which is why we have to resort to remote teaching. Today we will talk about the introduction into Spacelaw and space policy and some general aspects. Other reading material can be found on the Moodle platform. Also, today's presentation can be found on Moodle. You can go through that. In parallel with me, I will tell you which slides to look at. For any further questions, do not hesitate to contact me via email or also via the phone. It is at the last page of our presentation, or just look at this paper here. And here you find my email address and my cell phone number. So let's just begin. If you have a look at slide number 2, the preamble of the Outer Space Treaty says that space activities are to be carried out in the interest of all mankind and for the benefit of all peoples. So what is really important is that international space law mainly consists of public international law. Therefore, we have to look at the basics of public international law, which are on slide number 3. Space law is rooted in public international law. The norms of space law do form a part of public international law. So now, what is public international law? Public international law is the sum of legal norms regulating the behavior of subjects of international law. And the most important subjects of public international law are sovereign states. But there are, of course, also other subjects of public international law. One that does come to our mind are, for example, international organizations. Others are institutions such as the Holy See. The Holy See is, of course, in a very specific situation here, as the Holy See being mainly the institution of the Pope, the papacy. And the Pope, of course, is at the same time the sovereign, the head of state of the sovereign state of the Vatican City, which is an internationally recognized state as such, which means that the Holy See is here in a very specific situation, namely being a non-state subject of public international law and at the same time also a state subject of international law, which is why, for example, the Holy See at the United Nations or at other international organizations is almost always seated as a state, also normally under the name Holy See. So these two institutions are largely intertwined, and especially they also share the same institutions, especially in the sense of foreign policy. For example, if you think of the Vatican Secretariat of State, that is representing the Vatican City State as well as the Holy See at international conferences and in foreign policy in general. The same is with international representations, the embassies, so-called apostolic nunciatures. Other subjects of public international law can be institutions such as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, to some degree, and certain states have afforded this status also to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And of course there could be, and there are even other such organizations and institutions that can have this status of being a subject of public international law. One other institution that could come to our mind is, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, if we go to slide number 4, its important aspects of public international law as such, and especially in space law, are questions of international responsibility and liability. So what does this mean? It basically means the attribution of breaches of legal obligations by subjects of public international law. Every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. This is something you can, for example, find in Article 1 of the draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. And then liability is understood as the obligation to settle damages. So, to sum up, responsibility means the state or the entity that is responsible is the one that actually has to accept the responsibility for any breach of international law that had happened. Now, what to do with it, for example, any settlement of damages, this is a question of liability. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now let's go to slide number 5. We have the different sources of a public international law. Well, the first and most important one is nowadays international treaties. So this can be international conventions, whether they are general or particular. They establish rules that are expressly recognized by the contesting states. Then another source of public international law that has a very long tradition and has been there for almost forever since international law exists is international custom. So international custom can form as evidence of a general public practice accepted as law. Then we have general principles of law. The general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. And then there are certain subsidiary sources. These can be judicial decisions and the teachings of the most highly qualified publicists of the various nations as subsidiary means for the determination of rules of law. So what comes into our mind here, as an example, could especially be decisions, for example, by the International Court of Justice or other arbitrary bodies. Then let's go to slide number 6, where we already go into the specifics of space law here. So the sources of space law. The most important source of space law, of course, is treaty law. The law of treaties is codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The core of the Codex Juris Spatialis, so the body of space law in general, so like the collection of international space law norms, consists of 5 international treaties, with the Outer Space Treaty taking the first and most essential place. Then, as in public international law always, we have customary law, and then we have general principles of law that are deducted from national or international legal systems by means of comparison, analogy, and so on. They are then considered subsidiary to treaty and custom. Right. To go on, slide number 7. Further sources of space law can be soft law sources. So, soft law is described as non-legally binding instruments which nevertheless can have quasi-legal effects, like for example resolutions by the United Nations General Assembly, but also other so-called soft law regulations such as codes of conduct, guidelines, informal agreements, memoranda of understanding, and so on. This is a form of international lawmaking that has become more and more popular, so to speak, in international affairs in the past years. And then we have jus cogens norms. Jus cogens means, of course, law that is obligatory. So these are international legal norms from which no derogation is permitted. So these are primarily treaty and customary law. Then let's go on to slide number 8. The space law regime is a so-called territorial legal regime, meaning it applies primarily to a certain area, a geographic area. Now this might sound a little bit weird in the context of space law, I do agree, but that's it. So to sum it just up, space law applies in outer space. We have got also other territorial regimes in international law. The most important and most well-known one, also with the longest legal tradition, is of course the law of the sea. Then we have got air law, that might also be called aviation law, and then most importantly also the Antarctic Treaty System. So these 4, space law, the law of the sea, air law, and Antarctic law, if you want to call it that way, are all very much intertwined. Of course, air law is by nature very closely connected to space law because, of course, in order to fly to space, you have to cross airspace. But then, of course, there are differences. Those are different legal regimes with different norms. Now, the law of the sea is also very important because many norms of space law are somewhat deducted or derived from the law of the sea, and some general principles of the law of the sea also apply in space. And to look into the Antarctic Treaty System, well, the Antarctic Treaty was conceived at a similar time, a little bit earlier as international space law, and it has some very similar provisions, and to some degree actually the Antarctic Treaty also was a role model for international space lawmaking. Let's go on to slide number 9 to go into some further detail of the law of the sea. So for centuries, lots of law of the sea was of course to be derived from international custom. There were huge sums of laws, norms of customary international law, and other legal documents that were concluded internationally on law of the sea. And in 1982, the United Nations concluded the so-called UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So most of the provisions in there were not especially new, but they were codified into one convention, and there were some adaptations. So one of the most important norms here is territorial waters form part of the territory of the adjacent coastal state and are subject to that state's sovereignty. So for many centuries, this coastal waters stretched for about 3 miles off the coast of a coastal state. Now the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea actually allows states to enlarge their coast waters to a 12-mile territorial zone, so sovereign territorial waters. This was actually a development that had already begun before. States had already begun to claim 12-mile zones, and these were largely also recognized, but the 1982 Convention then codified that into international law. Why the initial 3-mile zone? Well, it had to do with the fact that coastal artillery in the old times had a range. Those coastal cannons had a range of 3 miles. So states claimed a 3-mile territorial sovereign zone, basically the zone they could actually defend with their coastal artillery. So there is also a certain tactical component of defining the applicability of a legal regime. Bear that in mind, it might also be interesting in space law. And then the other important provision of international space law is that the high seas are regarded as res communis, so as an area that basically belongs to everybody, is free for everybody's use and exploration. Also, one provision that is very important to bear in mind for application in space law. More about that later. So there are certain concepts, as I had already mentioned, in the law of the sea that is then also mirrored with space law provisions. So we have, for example, that concept of the freedom of the high seas. This is basically mirrored in the space freedoms in Part 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, slide number 10, by the way. Then we've got the so-called right of innocent passage in the law of the sea, which largely can be seen as the access to outer space, and that is basically free to all. Of course, that can be contested sometimes. That can also be found in Part 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. Then we've got principle of the registration of ships. Ships are, of course, registered in so-called ships registers that should be run by every country, under whose flags those ships are operating on the seas. So this is mirrored also with the principles of the registration of space objects. Mainly you find those in Part 2 of the Registration Convention. Then we have the jurisdiction of the flag state. Also, basically this does mean the state under whose flag a ship is operating has jurisdiction over this ship, and for example also can deal with crimes that were committed on that ship flying the respective country's flag. This can also be found in the Outer Space Treaty Part 2, mainly when it is provided that the registering state keeps the registration, the jurisdiction over a space object. And then we've got a concept, the seabed as common heritage of mankind. This is one that is also sometimes a little bit contested with the law of the sea regime, but even more so in space. There it is mainly to be found in Part 2 of the Moon Agreement, where the Moon and other celestial bodies are also named as the common heritage of mankind. But this is very much contested, and this is one reason why the Moon Agreement has only very few states parties. More about that also later. Then we have also got a seabed arms control regime. This can also be found with the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit that can be found in Part 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. Let's go on to slide number 11 to go into more details on air law. So one of the fundamental issues of air law, especially in comparison to space law, is that states do have complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above their territory. This can especially be found also in Article 1 of the Paris Convention on the Regulation of Aerial Navigation of the year 1919. And this state sovereignty over airspace fundamentally differs from the non-appropriation principle of outer space that can be found in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. So what does non-appropriation mean? Well, it does mean that a state cannot claim sovereignty over any part of outer space. Now, one of the interesting things here is we do not have a clear differentiation of where actually airspace ends and outer space begins, which is somewhat funny if you consider that we have got two largely different legal regimes, both actually obligatory legal regimes. States have signed up to them, but there is no clear definition where the applicability of one legal regime ends and the applicability of the other one begins. There are, of course, certain working definitions, technical definitions, and so on. So the one working definition we mostly work with is the so-called von Karman line, named after the Hungarian-American scientist Theodor von Karman. He postulated a line that is by 100 kilometers above sea level. A line that does make certain sense because it is mainly a height where an aircraft can no longer sustain aerodynamic flight, and where, on the other hand, the atmospheric drag is too large to actually allow a satellite a proper Earth orbit. But again, as well, this is somewhat fluid. Also, the density, for example, of the atmosphere can sometimes vary according to atmospheric circumstances, weather events, and so on. And also, for example, I do know that sometime in the 1970s, the British Ministry of Defence, for example, launched a military communication satellite that failed to reach its proper orbit, and it managed to do at least one full Earth orbit in 96 kilometers height, so which would be 4 kilometers below that so-called von Karman line. Nonetheless, this von Karman line is largely accepted by organizations such as the International Astronautical Federation or the International Aeronautical Federation. Another definition that we do have is the one that is being used mainly by the US Air Force, US Space Force, and NASA, the US Space Agency, which is at around 80 kilometers. So, but still, also, this is a definition where the United States does not actually claim any legal consequence to that, apart from that pilots flying above 80 kilometers have been or are being awarded astronaut wings, so they are being considered astronauts then. Of course, during the year 2016 and onwards, the International Astronautical Federation has also gone a little bit more into that field of the United States, so has given some hints that they might settle with an 80-kilometer boundary as well. But as I said, these are working definitions, but no proper legal definitions. Then there is also the technical approach, just saying that space is, for example, where an aircraft, as I had said, no longer can sustain atmospheric flight, or where a satellite can no longer orbit properly due to the atmospheric drag. But so this is also the problem here, that we don't have a proper clear boundary or border. Another definition that is largely favored by American colleagues is that you just go towards the intention. So if it is a space mission for a spacecraft is launched on a space mission, then space law is to be applied. If it is an aircraft that is defined as an aircraft, registered as an aircraft, then this should be just an aeronautical mission, some organization, some undertaking that actually is intended as atmospheric flight, then air law should apply. Right, let's go on to our next comparable matter, which is the Antarctic Treaty System. So the legal status of the Antarctic continent on slide 13 is governed by the Antarctic Treaty System that has been developed as a result of the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. And the International Geophysical Year is also here interesting because this was an international undertaking of that was intended to foster many international research projects. Also the launches of the first artificial satellites, Sputnik 1 by the Soviet Union, Explorer 1 by the United States, were actually undertaken as part of this International Geophysical Year. The Antarctic region can be compared in many aspects with outer space. On the one hand, it's a very remote region, it is very difficult to reach, then it's a very hostile environment, it is probably rich in natural resources, and it is very important for scientific discovery. This is one of the many reasons why the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 can be seen as a direct predecessor of the Outer Space Treaty. Also, you can see there is, it is roughly the same time as space law has begun. Let's now go on. Next page, slide number 14. The major provisions of the Antarctic Treaty. The use of Antarctica is restricted to peaceful purposes only. Then, any measures of a military nature are prohibited. Nonetheless, the use of military personnel or hardware on Antarctic bases or for any Antarctic research activities is not prohibited. Then, freedom of scientific investigation and cooperation toward that end. Then it is prohibited to make any new claims or to enlarge any existing claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica while the Antarctic Treaty is enforced. So this is also very similar to the already mentioned principle of non-appropriation in outer space, just with one small difference. There are already territorial claims being made in the Antarctic, namely by the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and Norway. So the Antarctic Treaty does not generally dismiss those claims, but it just forbids any newer claims, and it also forbids those countries that currently do claim territory in the Antarctic from extending those claims they already have, and those claims cannot be legally enforced at the time being. But on the other hand, the states are not prohibited from making any preparations for enforcing that claim. So setting up, for example, any authorities, governmental institutions to administer and enforce laws in those territories is not prohibited. Then one important provision is also that the contracting parties shall provide open access to all areas of Antarctica, including stations, installations, and equipment. And all activities in Antarctica should be consistent with the United Nations Charter. And then, if we go on to slide number 15, one difference is also, as I'd already mentioned, unlike the Outer Space Treaty or other international or UN space law treaties, the Antarctic Treaty does contain a geographical delimitation of its application, namely the area south of 60 degrees latitude. Alright, let's go on to slide number 16. let's go a little bit into the history of space law. And also, this is, of course, cannot be made without doing providing some insight into the history of space flight, of course. So, space flight in the first third of the 20th century. Well, there were some early space pioneers who laid the mathematical, scientific, and technological foundations of space flight in the first part of the 20th century. Names that come to our mind are such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Robert Goddard, Hermann Oberth, Hermann Potočnik, and others. So, while Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Hermann Oberth were largely theoreticists who did important, nonetheless, theoretic research on rocketry and spaceflight, others like Hermann Oberth, like Robert Goddard, got into more practical application. Goddard did a lot of practical and hands-on experiments with rockets, and he actually is the inventor of the liquid propulsion rocket, so a rocket that does not use any solid propulsion material such as gunpowder, but rather liquid fuels. And of course I had to mention Hermann Potočnik because he is here from Styria, or from the so-called Lower Styria, Steyerska region in Slovenia, where he was born, but he spent part of his career also here in Graz, and some of his work also dealt with, for example, theoretical work on the feasibility of space stations. And then, of course, rocket technology, especially the one that had been invented by Goddard, had been further developed and then saw some use already in the Second World War. For example, Goddard himself was involved with the so-called RATO program to further develop rockets for, RATO stands for Rocket Assisted Takeoff, so rockets that could give an aircraft additional push in order to take off on shorter runways with higher cargo and higher payloads. Then one important weapon system that does come to our mind is, of course, the German A4 Aggregat 4 or V2 rocket, one of the first ballistic missiles being actually used in anger, and to some success. Of course, those weapons did not decide the war. Maybe more important was actually one American weapon that also used rocket technology, the so-called bazooka. The term might ring a sound to some of you. The bazooka was an anti-tank rocket, firing a rocket-propelled grenade against enemy tanks, and technology that is still being widely used for that application. Let's go on to slide number 17. In parallel, we do have several pioneers of space law. The first reference to problems of space law were made in a commentary on air law published by Émile Laude in France in 1910. Then the Soviet aviation expert V.A. Zaza published the first paper on legal problems associated to interplanetary flight in 1926, so this was well before we had actually the first space flight. And the Czech lawyer Vladimir Mandl wrote the first monograph on space law in that time. And then we had a paper by Mr. Korovin on the conquest of the stratosphere and international law, published in 1933. Let's go on then to page number 18, the advent of the space age proper. So it is not entirely clear, there is no foolproof, but it is very likely that at least one test flight of an A4 or V2 rocket of the German Wehrmacht during the first half of the 1940s, so during World War II, actually reached outer space, so might have reached a height of around 100 kilometers. What we do know is that after 1945, when the United States got hold of the German rocket technology, and many of the technicians, especially the engineers and the scientists who did develop those weapons, those rockets, Wernher von Braun and his staff, well, and also lots of German rocket hardware. Well, they brought von Braun and his staff and also the rockets to the United States and made many flight experiments with those rockets there. with some of those experiments, they did reach outer space, especially with one further development of the V2 rocket, namely the so-called bumper rocket. The bumper was the first two-stage rocket. Mainly it was a V2 rocket coupled with a WAC Corporal rocket that had been developed in the United States, and that was put on top of the V2 rocket as a second stage. Why do rockets have several stages? Well, the main reason is in order to save weight. A rocket stage largely consists, apart from the rocket engine itself, of fuel tanks. So once a fuel tank is empty, you can discard of the additional weight. It makes the rocket somewhat lighter and makes it easier to ascend then. And of course then the engine of the second stage would kick in and would just have to carry the weight of the second stage and the third, should there be one. And then of course, let's go on. In the 1940s, 1950s saw further development, especially with so-called sounding rockets, being suborbital rocket flights, going into the upper atmosphere or even into outer space, always very much interconnected with the development, of course, of ballistic missiles, especially the ones that were intended to carry nuclear warheads. And of course, then this all culminated in 1957-58, as I already mentioned, in the International Geophysical Year, with the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, by the Soviet Union, followed a few weeks later by the American satellite Explorer 1. Then other highlights of this time were, for example, the launch of SCORE, the first communication satellite, also the first reconnaissance satellite, the American Corona satellite. You can also see a picture of the Corona satellite at the bottom of slide number 18. And then of course we had Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, followed 1 month later by Alan Shepard, the first American astronaut to go to space. Then let's go on to slide number 19 to go on. Yes, of course the 1960s and already the late 1950s were very much dominated by what we nowadays call the space race. So we saw a certain race. As I said, the Soviet Union was of course successful, taking the lead in the space race, launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, then Sputnik 2, the first satellite actually carrying a living being, namely the dog Laika, into outer space. Then also bringing the first human being into outer space, Yuri Gagarin, on Vostok 1. But one has to say that the United States normally was not very far behind. So Sputnik 1 was launched in October 1957, followed by the American Explorer 1 in January of 1958, or for example, the American astronaut Alan Shepard was launched into outer space just 1 month after Yuri Gagarin made his first human space flight. One other success a little bit early by the Americans was also, for example, the launch of the chimpanzee Ham into outer space. So this chimpanzee actually provided lots of interesting scientific proof. For example, it proved that you do not completely lose your orientation or even consciousness in outer space in the weightlessness. So Ham could perform the tasks he was trained to do back on Earth, also in outer space, for example, pressing certain buttons on the instrument panel and so on. And I already said, first humans to go into outer space, Yuri Gagarin, Alan Shepard, then we went on, the Soviet Union and the United States launched their first multi-person spacecraft, Voskhod and Gemini, and then of course it culminated with the race to the moon, which was of course, as we all know, won by the United States in 1969 with Apollo 11, the first crewed moon landing, and followed by several more manned missions by the United States to the moon. Then the 1970s saw a certain consolidation, especially in manned programs, but not to forget, the first space stations were launched in that time. Also, once again, the Soviet Union took the lead. Having lost the race to the moon, they decided to focus on sustained human presence in Earth orbit. The first undertaking was the Salyut space station, By the way, here I see there is a typo on slide number 19. Salyut is spelled with only one L, so I have to apologize here. The Salyut was the first of a series of very successful space stations that were launched during the 1970s and 80s by the Soviet Union. Also during the 1970s, the United States launched the Skylab space station, one of the largest space stations having been built so far. It was basically made out of a third stage of a Saturn V rocket, which was also the rocket that brought the Apollo astronauts to the moon. And it was manned several times in 1973 and 1974. And then we had important interplanetary probes during the 1970s, especially the American Pioneer series, the Russian Venera series to the planet Venus. One has to say most of the Venera probes either were destroyed or were lost or functioned for only a very short time. Nonetheless, one has to also recognize the very important contributions those probes did make to scientific exploration of Venus, especially as the atmosphere of Venus is highly toxic, very high pressure, so any spacecraft can only survive a rather short time on the planet Venus. Then, very important were of course the American Viking probes that flew to Mars in the 1970s. Those were probes that made the first successful landings on the Martian surface. They even could dig a little bit into the surface of Mars. They could provide color images. They were often very much considered a very good substitute for human exploration of Mars, or at least for the time until we might one day be able to reach Mars with astronauts, for example. And then of course there were the Voyager probes, also called the Grand Tour of the solar system. So the Voyager probes basically then visited all the planets that had so far not been visited by spacecraft from Earth, save for the planet Pluto. But this is of course somewhat relative, as many of you might know. The International Astronomical Union somewhat downgraded the status of the planet Pluto a few years ago. So Pluto is no longer considered a planet. Therefore, one could say, with the successes of Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, all the planets in the solar system were actually visited. And by the way, the American New Horizons probe flew by the planet, the now categorized as a minor planet or a dwarf planet Pluto a few years ago. Then, of course, also importantly, during the 1970s, the United States developed the Space Shuttle, the first, at least partially reusable spaceplane that made its first successful flight in 1981. You see a picture of this flight also at the bottom of slide number 19. And let's go on to slide number 20. So this early era of spaceflight, of the space race, was also the era of space law codification. So very soon there was some international consensus on basic legal rules applying to space activities that should be set up. So one of the first we had was the so-called Legal Principles Declaration. So the Declaration on Legal Principles Governing the Peaceful Use of Outer Space that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1963. And then in 1967 the Outer Space Treaty was adopted and opened for signature in 1967, and it entered into force in the same year. The Outer Space Treaty largely mirrors the provisions of the Principles Declaration, but it further elaborates on them and goes into further detail. And then the Outer Space Treaty was followed by first the Astronaut Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement until 1979. So this was a year when the Moon Agreement was adopted. The Liability Convention, for example, is one that mainly deals with the already mentioned questions of responsibility and especially liability. That is also being dealt with in the Outer Space Treaty, but the Liability Convention further elaborates on the applicable regime and the procedure on how to settle the damages. The Astronaut Rescue Agreement was very easily conceived in 1968. It was comparably easy to find consensus on that one. It mainly deals with the rescue of astronauts if they have to make an emergency landing somewhere outside of the jurisdiction of their home country, and in order to safely return them to their country, and also to safely to return any equipment, any spacecraft that might have to make an emergency landing. The more difficult area was the Moon Agreement. As I had already mentioned, the Moon Agreement does contain provisions such as on the declaring the Moon common heritage of mankind, and also the it does postulate that any state has to share any profits being made by, or any benefits they can derive from lunar exploration and use with all other states, especially developing states. I mean, this was a provision that was largely brought into the draft treaty by, of course, developing states that by that time already had a majority in the UN General Assembly, but this was somewhat a turn-off for the major space powers, and this is one reason why we have only some roughly 15 or I think 18 now ratifications of the Moon Agreement, and none of the major space powers like the United States, Russia, China, Japan, United Kingdom, France, Germany, South Africa, Israel have ratified that. And actually only very few of the states parties to the Moon Agreement have actually some major space activities going on. The only ones that do come to my mind now are, for example, Pakistan or Turkey, that do undertake some major space exploration and space activities. No moon programs at the moment, of course. And let's go on to slide number 21. Of course, at the same time, space history, space flight went on. The Soviets launched their very successful space station Mir in 1986. The United States and the European Space Agency ESA started to cooperate on the Spacelab project. Spacelab was a laboratory module that could fit into the Space Shuttle's payload bay, thereby somewhat extending the laboratory and work facilities on the Space Shuttle, and also providing space for scientific experiments and other undertakings for extended missions on the Space Shuttle during Space Shuttle flights, so to speak. Then the European Space Agency also developed its rather successful Ariane launcher series. The first Ariane rocket, Ariane 1, was launched in 1979. Now we are currently using the Ariane 5, so the fifth iteration of the Ariane system, for the launching of European and also other satellites from friendly nations or commercial customers. And we are currently developing the Ariane 6 launcher to further provide what we call guaranteed European access to space. Then, of course, during the 1980s, the United States started development of a space station, the so-called, they called it then the Space Station Freedom, and they invited allied states from Europe, as well as Canada and Japan, to participate in this project, and it evolved into the International Space Station. The first modules were eventually launched in 1998, and the space station has been continually manned since the year 2000, being a very successful and sustainable example of crewed exploration of outer space, and also of international cooperation in outer space, of course. Then one also major step was, of course, the establishment of the United States Space Force in December of last year. So the Space Force is now operational. You may have heard last weekend the first 68 or so officers were commissioned into the United States Space Force after they had finished the US Air Force Academy last Saturday. And of course we have had for example, the so-called Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, who was transferred to the Space Force before, of course, in order to take up command, and also his senior enlisted advisor. Other personnel has been at least temporarily assigned now to the Space Force, and they from the United States Air Force, and they will transfer to the Space Force during that year. And of course then, short glimpse into the future, a somewhat successor to the International Space Station is of course the planned Lunar Gateway, so a project that was also again conceived by the Americans, and very soon they brought in also the space station partners, especially Russia, Canada, Japan, European Space Agency, and the United Kingdom, and also as a new partner now Australia have signed up already. Negotiations are currently underway on the Gateway, and well, the construction of the Gateway, namely a space station in lunar orbit or in the lunar region, the construction will commence sometime in the 2020s. This should also facilitate the further manned exploration of the moon. That is also one very important target of especially the current US administration, so to return a manned presence to the moon by the 2020s. So let's go on to slide number 22, where we go on then from the era of treaties to the era of resolutions and also beyond. So we could largely consider the the Moon Agreement a failure. Most countries, and especially those that are actually active in space, did not ratify it, did not actually accept this. So also the political momentum somewhat shifted, and the further development of space law was then largely done through United Nations General Assembly resolutions. So those resolutions dealt mainly with practical issues such as direct satellite broadcasting, nuclear power sources in outer space, international cooperation in outer space, and so on. And then even more so other soft law than instruments that have been conceived ever since. Different kinds of codes of conduct, guidelines, and as I said, memoranda of understanding, and so on. One of the most recent ones was when the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space decided on the guidelines on the guidelines on the sustainable use of long-term sustainability of outer space. Guidelines on long-term sustainability of outer space. And the one major advantage of soft law instruments is, because soft law is not enforceable or is not obligatory, it makes it easier for all parties involved to actually find consensus on them. At the same time, it does not necessarily mean that you can easily dismiss them, because you might not want to be the one that starts actually not to adhere to those rules. So as long as everyone adheres to them, there is a certain pressure to also stick to those rules. And let's go on to slide number 23. The current legal issues we are facing are issues that especially have to do with privatization and commercialization of outer space. You have probably heard about some of those companies that are very successfully active in commercially now in outer space, especially SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, of course. And then there's also a company, Blue Origin, that was founded by the Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. That's especially focusing also on space tourism or on manned space flight, but also on further development on of rocket technology. I reckon NASA has already contracted Blue Origin also for rocket technology to be used on a future lunar lander. Then you may have heard of Virgin Galactic. This company, owned by the British billionaire Sir Richard Branson, focuses mainly on space tourism. So they have developed a spacecraft that should bring space tourists into, suborbital space in the very near future. They have already conducted 2 successful space flights, but not yet with tourists. But they have already flown commercial payloads, scientific payloads, for example, also under contract with NASA, for example. And we are very very optimistic that commercial flights with tourists should start anytime soon. Probably once this public health crisis we currently have has somewhat subsided, of course. I mean, this is affecting tourism as well, as we all know. And of course, Virgin has also spun off another company from Virgin Galactic that's now under the brand Virgin Orbit that should launch also smart satellites from an aircraft. Also, some successful test flights in the Earth's atmosphere have already taken place. The first satellite launch should take place very soon. Also, this seems very promising. Also, they already have contracts, for example, with the British Royal Air Force, also for launches probably from the UK commercial spaceport in Cornwall sometime soon. And then what we have had is actually one return to space law treaty making with the UNIDROIT Space Assets Protocol, namely the Cape Town Convention on International Interest in Mobile Equipment. Also does deal, for example, with different mobile equipment, inter alia also with space assets, and there is also a Space Assets Protocol that deals specifically with those space assets. And this is a treaty that was concluded a few years ago and has already got the first signatures and ratifications. So actually in a sense, the first space law treaty since 1979. Then there is the ongoing question of space mining. Of course, we might still be several years away from any feasible commercial space mining, but the legal discussion is already there. It is mainly pushed by states like the United States, but also Luxembourg. And there are some legal issues here. While the United States has actually in her Space Resources Act referred to US obligations under international law and somehow made sure that the Space Resources Act actually complies with the international space law regime. And the legal provisions in Luxembourg, it might be even a little bit more difficult because they make no mention of international law and that's sometimes even contradicting it there. Then there is of course the question of militarization. We've got issues like I already mentioned. The US has set up a US Space Force. The United Kingdom is going to set up a Space Command this year. France has also announced its intention. Then there is the Chinese Strategic Support Force that is mainly dealing with space and cyber activities. What one has to say here is, of course, that the mere setting up of a specified space force does in no way contradict the whole notion of peaceful use of outer space or those non-weaponizations and so on. I mean, Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty only deals with weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit, and then in a second part, then the militarization of celestial bodies. But actually, what this does mean is that any other military use is basically allowed. So any other weapon can be brought into outer space. Then outer space is free for exploration and use. Use generally. There's no talk about military use being prohibited in Earth orbit, for example, or anywhere else in space. As I said, there are some provisions concerning celestial bodies, some restrictions there, but not in space as such. And then basically what does it mean if you just take the example of the United States Space Force? So the US Space Force mainly was a redesignation or a spin-off from the US Air Force Space Command into an armed service of its own, a proper armed force dealing with space. So, broadly spoken, whether a spacecraft carries the title US Air Force or US Space Force is legally not really relevant. I mean, if it was legal before December 2019, it still is legal today. And then there are, of course, questions of long-term sustainability of space debris and, of space activities. Mainly these are questions of space debris, frequency allocation, and so on, with the growing number of space objects being launched and the ever-growing space activities. And let's go on to slide number 24, where we would like to go a little bit more into detail on a current development. As I said, the US Space Force. It was established on December 20th, 2019. It is a space warfare service branch of the United States Armed Forces, and its first national security space launch took place on March 26th this year. It was also broadcast live on live stream and news channels and so on. And as I said, last weekend, the first young officers were commissioned into the Space Force. Then, as we have already discussed, the mere existence or the current activities of the United States Space Force do in no way infringe the current international space law. As we have said, the Outer Space Treaty only puts very specific limits on military uses of outer space, and renaming a military service branch does in no way affect its legality under international space law. If you take a look at the small picture on the bottom right of slide number 24, you can see the launch of the AEHF-6 satellite by the United States Space Force that was undertaken in March this year. And let's go on to slide number 25. Let's talk about UN COPUOS, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. This is an intergovernmental body of the United Nations General Assembly. It is a main discussion forum for UN member states on matters relating to the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space. It is based in Vienna, and it has two subcommittees. One is the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, the other is the Legal Subcommittee, and then of course there is a main body that's also functioning. So let's go on to slide number 26. The mandate of UN COPUOS is to review, as appropriate, the area of international cooperation and to study practical and feasible means for giving effect to programs in the peaceful uses of outer space, which could appropriately be undertaken under United Nations auspices, including inter alia, the assistance for the continuation on a permanent basis of the research on outer space, the organization of the mutual exchange and dissemination of information on outer space research, encouragement of national research programs for the study of outer space, and the rendering of all possible assistance and help towards their realization. To study the nature of legal problems which may arise from the exploration of outer space. Let's now go on to slide number 27. As I've already said, UN COPUOS has two standing subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee. So, UN COPUOS and its two subcommittees are based in Vienna, normally convened in Vienna. Professor Brunner and myself, and also Ms. Rehner, are members of the Austrian delegation to this committee, the UN COPUOS, and I was again part this February at the last session of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. I also serve as a member of UN COPUOS's working group on nuclear power sources in outer space. Then the Legal Subcommittee was due to convene in March and early April of this year. Unfortunately, the already so often mentioned corona crisis then prevented us from actually convening the committee, the subcommittee, and unfortunately this also made it impossible for us to take some of you, as I had promised you actually in the first briefing session of the seminar, to take me with you for a day or two at the subcommittee. So, and even the main committee that normally convenes in June has now been postponed. It will, at least these are the plans at the moment, convene in late August, second half of August, and at that time we might have also a one-day session at least to at least formally convene and then adjourn again the legal subcommittee, if it is at all possible, if the public health situation will allow it at that time, which I very much of course hope. Yeah, but to to further talk about UN COPUOS, yes, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, that is also based in Vienna, which is a permanent office dealing with space matters, also serves as a secretariat of UN COPUOS. UN COPUOS currently has 92 member states, and it played a decisive role in the process of developing and codifying space law, and it continues to do so. So the already mentioned space law treaties, they were all actually discussed and worked out by UN COPUOS, as were the UN General Assembly resolutions and those so-called principles that we already talked about, and for example also the already mentioned guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space. Let's now go on to slide number 28. So, recent developments in UN COPUOS. The number of member states has now grown to 95 members. Among the newest are, for example, Singapore, that joined this session. And the guidelines on long-term sustainability of outer space have been adopted, as I said. So these also deal with the avoidance of space debris and how to deal with frequencies and other issues. As I had told you already, due to the current public health crisis, also the 2020 session of the legal subcommittee was cancelled, and yes, we had to postpone even the main committee. One of the most important features of the decision making in UN COPUOS is the so-called consensus principle, which brings us to slide number 29. Decisions in UN COPUOS are reached by consensus, and UN COPUOS was the first UN body to use this method of consensus as its formal method of decision making. So what does a consensus principle mean? It means you can reach general agreement without a formal vote. And this was interesting, and it was brought up during the Cold War, because sometimes there was just a general distrust of each other, and for political reasons, one side, like let's say the Eastern Bloc, did just not want to vote along with the West for reasons of principle. So we came up with the consensus principle. So this basically says, as long as no member state objects, it is decided. This must not be confused with unanimity. Unanimity would mean that all parties or member states, for example, would unanimously vote with yes or no, for example. But as I said, with the consensus principle, we actually do not have a formal vote. There are no majority issues and so on. As long as nobody has an objection, a measure is adopted. But on the other hand, it actually gives every member state, in theory, a veto power, because if there is an objection, the measure cannot be adopted. So it can sometimes, of course, also prolong the decision-making process. And then this brings us to slide number 30, UNISPACE, the so-called UN conferences on the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space, or short UNISPACE. There have been 4 so far, and they have all taken place in Vienna. They were first all numbered with Roman numerals. It was the UNISPACE conference in 1968, then followed by UNISPACE 2 in 1982, UNISPACE 3 in 1999, and then the 4th was called UNISPACE Plus 50 in 2018. Why did we call it UNISPACE Plus 50? Well, basically because it took place 50 years after the 1968 UNISPACE conference, or also UNISPACE 1 conference, you could call it. So they were also organized by UNOSA and UN COPUOS, and also took place in Vienna. Just to give you a clear example, UNISPACE Plus 50 did take place in conjunction with the UN COPUOS main meeting in June of 2018, which brings us to slide number 31. So there was a certain way towards UNISPACE Plus 50. So when UN COPUOS at its 58th session in June 2015 endorsed the plan of work for UNISPACE Plus 50, and there was a series of high-level fora leading to that UNISPACE Plus 50 conference in 2018, where a number of activities then were organized by UNOSA and other parties for UNISPACE Plus 50. One of these activities that was also taking place in conjunction and in support of UNISPACE Plus 50 was the so-called Space Generation Forum 2.0. In the briefing session, I told you already about the Space Generation Advisory Council. This was actually founded on the occasion of the first Space Generation Forum that took place in conjunction with Unispace 3 in 1999. So Space Generation Forum 2.0 was, of course, in support of Unispace Plus 50. It intended, or it brought together all the different SGAC generations to celebrate SGAC's creation at Unispace 3, and also to discuss how the Council's activities should continue to evolve, considering the Unispace Plus 50 recommendations and specific aspects related to the UNOSA and UN COPUOS and its subcommittees. And also, it was a capacity building event that allowed SGAC members to better understand UNOSA, UN COPUOS, and also any international aspects of space from various perspectives. It showcased SGAC's roots and connection to the United Nations, in particular to UNOSA and UN COPUOS and subcommittees, of course. And it created outcomes based on 4 thematic pillars of Unispace Plus 50, also to pave the way towards the Space 2030 agenda. And plan to present outcomes in the form of conference room papers and technical presentations at Unispace Plus 50. Well, I was part of the organizing team of Space Generation 2.0. It was a great experience. It was a great also occasion to celebrate those anniversaries, so to speak, of Unispace and also of the Space Generation Forum and of SGAC as such. Going on then to the International Astronautical Congress. I did make some mention already, I think, about the International Astronautical Congress, or in short, IAC. Congresses take place every year normally and are organized by the International Astronautics Federation, and with its supporting bodies, the International Academy of Astronautics, the International Institute of Space Law, and also the Space Generation Advisory Council. The 2020 IAC is scheduled to take place in Dubai. Its theme is Inspire, Innovate and Discover, and it wants to share past achievements and future possibilities. Of course, we have to also again to consider the current developments, especially with the COVID-19 outbreak. So unfortunately, this also affects international space conferences, for example. So if you are interested in, for example, the IAC, do please monitor the web pages, mainly on iafastro.org. The one bad news I can already relate to you right now is, so far the organizers have decided to postpone the IAC 2020. A new date has not been set so far. Maybe late in 2020, maybe sometime in early 2021. Maybe the whole schedule might shift, that, for example, the Dubai Congress planned for 2020 might only take place in 2021, and the 2021 Congress to take place in Paris might then slip to 2022, and so on. Just be on the lookout if you're interested. Have a look on the websites of the IAC, of the International Astronautical Federation, and so on. And if you are interested, of course, do not hesitate to contact me. Which leads us to, for the information on the Congress, the IACs can also be found on slide 33, of course. Let's now go on to slide 34 to talk about further players and fora in space law. There is the already mentioned UN system, UN COPUOS, UNOSA, the United Nations General Assembly, of course, and the UN Conference of Disarmament, the UN Space Applications Program. Then we have got the International Organization on the Unification of Private Law, or in short, UNITROIT. For example, they have brought up the Cape Town Convention with its Space Assets Protocol that I already mentioned. Then there are other international and regional organizations, such as the International Telecommunications Union, the European Space Agency, the European Union, the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, NATO, the International Astronautical Federation, and so on. Then we've got national governments and national space administrations. So national space administrations might be very well known, of course. We know, for example, NASA, for example, the United Kingdom Space Agency, or the French Space Agency CNES, or the Japanese Space Agency JAXA, the Israeli Space Agency, and so on. Of course, as we are at an Austrian university, I have to mention the Austrian Air and Space Agency being a part of the Austrian Research Promotion Agency. And then, of course, we've got academia. Of course, this is an academic setting here. There is our university, for example, offering this space law class. There are organizations such as the International Space University, based in Strasbourg, also doing international programs outside of their main campus as well. We've got the International Law Association, the International Institute of Space Law, the International Academy of Astronautics, the European Center for Space Law, that also has a sub-point of contact here at our university. Of course, to say here is a little bit of a stretch at the moment, as you know, the campus is off limits. So if you want to get in contact, of course, again, email, telephone, whatever. Then there are non-governmental organizations like the already mentioned Space Generation Advisory Council, the Austrian Space Forum, the Moon Village Association, the British Interplanetary Society, and so on. There are several more. Let's go on then to slide number 35. We have the already mentioned European Center for Space Law is a center dealing with space law under the auspices of the European Space Agency, and it is one of ECSL's most successful activities. And the summer course of this year is planned, or has been planned, to take place in August this year in Portugal. But also the current developments may make this a little bit difficult on how to go on with the summer course, and how it will be decided these days by the ECSL board. Professor Brunner, by the way, is a board member, so as soon as we know anything clearer, we will inform you. But if you are interested in taking part in the summer course, again, do not hesitate to contact me. Also, have a look at the link that is provided on slide number 35, or just use Google in order to have a look for ECSL Summer Course 2020. And as I said, of course, keep in mind all the fluid developments due to the current public health crisis. Then we go on to slide number 36. There you find links to several sources of space law, for example, the UN Space Treaties and Principles, and also the Austrian Outer Space Act, the UNIDROIT Space Assets Protocol, or also the Antarctic Treaty. So all those links can be found on slide number 36. Then further useful links can be found on slide number 37, especially of our Center for Space Law, here in Graz, then also European Center for Space Law, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. This one is interesting because on their website you can also find all the UN space treaties and the principles and so on, either downloadable, or you could also order a booklet containing them from the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. And of course also the Space Generation Advisory Council and the Austrian Space Forum. So this brings us to the end of this presentation. I just want to once again also remind you of some probably useful literature. The main textbook for our class normally is, of course, this textbook by Alexander Soucek. I know it is hard to get, therefore the literature you really need is being made available to you via Moodle. Everything for this session is already on the platform. Some further reading is already on Moodle as well, and more might follow. Then, of course, we have this casebook where you could go somewhat deeper into the practical applicability, which might also be interesting for then the session in early May. At least one case is already available on Moodle. If you're interested in buying the books, and you might find, for example, books on the used market that might still look like this is not a problem. There are only very minor differences between those two editions. The main reason why it had to be done was just that the whole series of books actually switched publishers. So new layout, new printers, and slightly new design. And of course, if you are really interested, we've got this kind of a book. I think I already showed you. Outer Space in Society, Politics and Law. This is interesting also because there you can find some articles or some chapters can be individually purchased from Springer link from the Springer Publishers website. If you're interested, then just especially for reasons of being up to date. Of course, one of our newest publications was this one, Satellite-Based Earth Observation, and of course I just can't help but mentioning that this book was awarded the Social Sciences Book Award by the International International Academy of Astronautics in Washington last year, so we are very proud of that one. And if you want to go a little bit further into some details, even further going from the ordinary space science and space technology topics more further into also social sciences and even into philosophy and theology, I can also show you this book, Our Common Cosmos. It has been edited by a good friend of mine. This is the main reason, to be honest, why I'm also showing it to you. A very good book. As I said, space technology, space research, also in society, in policy, in philosophy and theology. So you might not find that too often. Well, this brings us to the conclusion of this lecture. Once again, if you have any further questions, do not hesitate to contact me. You can also find my contact details, of course, at the end of this presentation on slide number 38 or on Uni Graz Online. Just Google my name, maybe Hannes Meyer, University of Graz. You can easily find it. So I do thank you for your cooperations. Be on the lookout, as I said, how the crisis develops. Also be on the lookout for further emails or information on Moodle. We keep you updated. And if you do not feel updated, give me a call. I think we can navigate this crisis together, and we will find a way of dealing with this situation, and that you can all positively finish this seminar. So thank you for your understanding. Thank you for following this lecture, and we will stay in touch. Wish you all the best. God bless. Stay safe.